Mason Cole used to have his name printed in newspapers. Not on the front page, not the kind of fame that came with movie premieres or stadium lights, but the kind of quiet recognition small towns gave to men who came home from war, with medals pinned to dress uniforms, and pain folded behind their eyes. In Fort Drum, New York, they once called him a hero. In a county hall outside Syracuse, a senator had shaken his hand and praised his courage in Afghanistan. A local paper had run a photograph of him standing stiffly beside an American flag, his jaw tight, his eyes already somewhere else. 8 years later, no one recognized him beneath the overpass on the east side of Cleveland. The cold had a way of erasing a man. It turned breath into fog, fingers into clumsy sticks, dignity into something a person learned to carry in silence. Mason sat under the concrete ribs of the Innerbelt Bridge with his back against a support pillar. A torn army green blanket pulled around his shoulders, one boot braced against the frozen gravel. Traffic moved above him in a long, restless growl, tires hissing over wet pavement. Every few minutes, a truck crossed a joint in the bridge and sent a metallic crack through the structure. Each sound made Mason's left hand tighten. He told himself it was nothing. Expansion joints, winter roads, Cleveland being Cleveland. But his body had never fully returned from the war. Even after his passport, his dog tags, and the discharge papers said he had. Beside him, Ranger lifted his head. Ranger was a dark sable German shepherd with frost on his whiskers and old intelligence in his amber eyes. He was 9 years old, broad in the chest, scarred along one ear, and slower getting up than he had been when Mason first found him outside a county shelter 2 winters earlier. He had once belonged to a police handler in Ohio, or so the shelter woman had said. Too old for work, too intense for families, too watchful for apartments. Mason had looked at him through the chain-link kennel, and the dog had looked back without barking. That was how they chose each other. Ranger pressed his shoulder into Mason's thigh now, not asking for anything, just reminding him that there was still warmth in the world if a person stayed close enough to another living thing. "I hear it," Mason muttered. The dog's ears moved toward the bridge. A butt braked above them, releasing a sharp pneumatic hiss. Mason was no longer beneath concrete in Ohio. For 1 second, he was back outside a repair bay in Kunduz province. Sunlight white against the dust, diesel smoke hanging low over the yard. Sergeant Wade Collins was laughing at something. Always laughing, one hand on the winch housing of a recovery truck they had been ordered to inspect after 2 near failures. Wade had a daughter back home who sent drawings of horses in purple crayon. He taped them to the inside of the truck because he said it made bad days embarrassed to exist. Then came the hiss, then the snap, then the weight falling before any man could move fast enough to stop it. Mason's knee hit the gravel under the bridge. Before he realized, he had leaned forward. His breathing came thin and shallow. Ranger stood at once, turning his body across Mason's lap as if blocking something only the dog could see. "Easy," Mason whispered, though he was speaking to himself. Ranger's nose touched his wrist. Mason closed his eyes until the bridge returned, until the city returned, until Wade Collins became what the Army paperwork had made him. An accident, a procedural failure, operator negligence, a lie with a government seal. That lie had done more damage to Mason than the blast that ruined his knee. Wade had died because the hydraulic system had been faulty, because cheap parts had been approved by men who did not have to stand near them. Mason had written that in his statement. He had named the complaints. He had remembered dates, initials, prior reports. He had believed facts mattered. Colonel Victor Sloan had believed something else mattered more. The hearing had taken place in a room too clean for grief. White walls, gray carpet, a clock that ticked like it was measuring obedience. Sloan sat across the table in a pressed uniform, his silver hair neat, his eyes empty in the way only powerful men could afford. "The finding is operator negligence," Sloan had said. "That's not what happened, sir. The finding is final. The line failed. Wade filed a complaint 2 weeks before it happened." Sloan had rested one hand on the folder as if holding down a living thing. "The contractor supplies equipment across 3 theaters. We will not destabilize logistics over one tragic incident. 1 man died. 1 soldier failed to follow safety protocol." Mason remembered standing there with his hands shaking under the table. Not from fear, not yet. From disbelief. He had spent his adult life believing there was a chain of command above him and a moral floor beneath him. In that room, both vanished. 6 months later, he was out. 2 years later, he stopped answering calls. 3 years later, he stopped having an address. The city worker arrived just after noon, stepping carefully down the slope under the bridge with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. He wore a bright orange vest over a heavy coat and looked apologetic before he even opened his mouth. Mason saw him and knew. "Sir," the man said, "I'm sorry, we got a sweep scheduled. New safety order. Nobody can stay under here after today." Mason nodded once. The worker's eyes moved to Ranger. "There's a shelter intake on Payne Avenue. They might have beds. They take dogs?" The man looked away. Mason almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, I'm sorry," the worker said again. He probably was. That was the worst part. Most people who moved Mason along were not cruel. They were tired, overworked, following policy, trying not to think too much about what happened after they left. Mason gathered his life in 9 minutes. A tarp, a dented tin cup, 2 pairs of socks, a photograph of his sister he had not called in 4 years, a leash, a half-empty bag of dog food, a folding knife, a VA envelope with numbers he no longer believed would lead anywhere. He packed them into an old rucksack with one broken strap. Ranger stood beside him, alert, watching the worker, watching the road, watching Mason's hands. They left before the city crew came. The afternoon had the color of old steel. Low clouds pressed over Cleveland, and Lake Erie pushed a damp wind through the streets that found every seam in Mason's coat. He walked with Ranger along the service road toward the industrial flats, past warehouses with boarded windows, chain-link lots full of rusted trailers, and brick buildings with names painted on their sides by men long dead. By dusk, the city lights had begun to shimmer on frozen puddles. Mason had 82:46. He knew because he had counted it that morning and again after the worker left, as if arithmetic could make it less final. It was the last of his monthly disability money after food, bus fare, and the cheap motel room he had taken for 2 nights when Ranger's cough got bad. It was not enough for another room. Not one that would take a dog. Not one that did not demand identification and a deposit and questions Mason had no energy to answer. They needed a place out of the wind. That was how he remembered East Bank Machinery. The old plant sat half a mile from the river, a huge dead place of brick, broken glass, and skeletal conveyors that had once made parts for ships and heavy equipment. Mason had noticed it months earlier while looking for scrap copper he never found. A side building near the former gatehouse had seemed mostly intact. Security office, maybe. Dry, if nothing else. Ranger limped slightly by the time they reached the fence. "Almost there," Mason said. The dog did not look at him. Ranger's attention was fixed on a torn section of chain link behind a collapsed loading dock. Mason crouched, ignoring the pinch in his knee, and pulled the fence up just enough. Ranger went first. Mason followed, dragging his pack after him. Inside the perimeter, the world changed. The city noise became distant. The wind moved through the factory in long, hollow breaths. Shattered windows clicked in their frames. Snow dusted old rail tracks that disappeared beneath weeds and black ice. The plant rose around them like something not abandoned but waiting. Ranger stayed close. The security office was exactly where Mason remembered it. A square brick building, with a sagging metal awning and a door that hung crooked but closed. The sign above it had faded until only 3 letters remained, SEC. Mason pushed the door open with his shoulder. The room smelled of old paper, mouse droppings, and damp plaster. His small flashlight revealed a metal desk, a chair on its side, a rusted filing cabinet, and a narrow window filmed with grime but unbroken. The roof had leaked in one corner, but most of the concrete floor was dry. For a man with nowhere, it was enough. Ranger sniffed the perimeter twice, nosed the filing cabinet, then circled near the desk and lay down with a tired grunt. Mason spread the tarp over the cleanest part of the floor. He sat with his back to the wall, one hand on Ranger's ribs, feeling the steady rise and fall of the dog's breathing. That night, the temperature dropped hard. Mason slept in pieces. He woke to every groan of metal, every drip, every distant pop of ice settling in the factory bones. Once, around 3 in the morning, Ranger raised his head and stared at the door for a full minute. Mason held his breath until the dog lowered his chin again. Morning came gray and mean. Ranger's food was almost gone. Mason's own stomach cramped, but hunger had become background noise, the kind that followed him so steadily he barely separated it from weather. He gave Ranger the larger portion anyway and chewed 2 stale crackers from his coat pocket. Then he found the flyer. It was folded inside the VA envelope, damp at the edges from the bridge. Mason must have picked it up at a gas station 2 days earlier because the paper had been near the coffee machine, and he had been trying not to look desperate while asking for hot water. Lakeview Public Store Delinquent, Unit Day 11 a.m. Cash Only Mason, read it 3 times. He knew what those auctions were. Television had turned them into little treasure hunts, but men like Mason rarely found treasure. They found broken furniture, baby clothes, dead microwaves, mattresses nobody wanted, and the private leftovers of other people's collapses. Still, sometimes there were tools. Sometimes there was a bicycle. Sometimes there was something that could be sold for just enough dog food, just enough propane, just enough time. He looked at Ranger. The dog watched him with the calm expectation of an animal that did not understand money but understood movement. "It's stupid," Mason said. Ranger blinked. "Yeah, that's what I thought." By 10:30, they were walking toward Lakeview Public Storage on the industrial edge of Euclid, where rows of blue roll-up doors stood behind chain-link fence and a small office sold packing tape, padlocks, and the illusion that people could keep their lives in order if they rented enough square footage. About 20 people had gathered near the first row of units. Most had trucks. Some had gloves with rubber grips and flashlights that could expose the value of a room in 3 seconds. They glanced at Mason, then at Ranger, then away with the practiced indifference of people who knew trouble by silhouette. The auctioneer was a woman in a red knit hat and a black parka, maybe 50, with a voice that carried like a school principal's. Her name tag read Dana Pierce. "Same rules as always," she called. "Door opens, you look from outside. No touching. Cash due immediately. 48 hours to clear. Anything left after that becomes our problem, and I don't like problems." A few men laughed. Mason stood at the back. The first unit went for $950. It held restaurant equipment, stainless tables, and stacked crates wrapped in plastic. The second climbed to $400 because someone spotted contractor tools behind a couch. The third sold for $300 to a man who liked old records. Mason watched each bid rise beyond his world. By the 7th unit, his hope had become embarrassment. He should not have come. He should have used the money for food. He should have found a soup kitchen and a place under some loading dock, where the wind did not cut straight through the ribs. Ranger leaned against his leg. The last unit was at the far end of the property, near the fence where snow had drifted against the doors. Unit C-19. The lock was old and crusted with rust. Dana nodded to a worker who cut it with bolt cutters. The roll-up door resisted, then lurched open with a grinding scream. The smell came out first. Mold, wet cardboard, old cloth, something sour beneath it all. The professionals barely looked. The unit was packed badly, not with the neat geometry of valuables stored by someone careful, but with sagging boxes, split trash bags, a broken dressers, stained blankets, yellowed newspapers, a lamp without a shade, and piles of things that had softened in damp air. One man shined a light across the floor and snorted. "Dump run," he said. Dana tried anyway. "Who'll give me 50? No one answered. 20? Silence. Mason should have walked away then. He knew it. Some part of him was already stepping backward. Then Ranger pulled on the leash. Not hard, just enough. The dog's nose aimed toward the dark back of the unit. His ears had tilted forward, not in excitement but concentration. Mason felt the leash tighten against his glove. "No!" Mason whispered. Ranger did not move his eyes from the unit. Dana looked directly at Mason. "You want it for 20? Mason swallowed. A man behind him chuckled. "Careful, buddy. Costs more to throw it away than it's worth." Mason heard Wade Collins laughing in the sun. He heard Colonel Sloan telling him what a life was worth. He heard every voice that had ever reduced him to a problem someone else wanted cleared. "I'll give 70, Mason said. The word surprised even him. Dana blinked. 70? A younger bidder in a clean Carhartt jacket smirked. 75. Mason's throat tightened. He had $82.46. There would be no bus after this, no food, no margin. 80, Mason said. The young man looked at him, amused, then raised both hands. "Enjoy the landfill." Dana waited 2 seconds longer than necessary. "Sold. Unit C-19, $80. Mason paid with hands that felt detached from his body. Dana gave him a receipt. She looked at Ranger and then back at Mason. Something softened in her face. "You got 48 hours, she said quietly. "You need longer. Come talk to me. Don't just disappear." Mason nodded, because he could not trust his voice. When everyone left, the storage facility became strangely still. The wind pushed an empty plastic bag along the asphalt. Somewhere beyond the fence, a freight train dragged itself through the city with a sound like chains being pulled across the sky. Mason stood before the open unit. "Well," he said to Ranger, "we own garbage." The dog walked in first. Mason spent the next hour confirming the obvious. The boxes collapsed when he touched them. Books had swollen into bricks. Clothing had gone black at the folds. A dresser drawer contained nothing but cracked cassette tapes and mouse droppings. The broken lamp was worthless. The blanket smelled too bad for Mason to use. His $80 had become rot. At first he worked quickly, driven by the need to prove one object, any object, would justify the mistake, then slower. Then he stopped pretending. He sank onto the edge of a plastic crate that cracked under his weight and put both hands over his face. He had failed Ranger. That was the thought that hurt. He had made bad decisions before. Drink, silence, pride, vanished appointments, unanswered calls, the long walk away from people who still wanted him, before they finally learned not to. But this was different. Ranger had followed him through cold and hunger without complaint, and Mason had taken the last money they had and traded it for mold. The old shadow moved in. It always began as heaviness behind the eyes. Then came the room with gray carpet, the folder beneath Colonel Sloane's hand, Wade's name flattened into a lie. Mason heard his own voice, younger and still believing courage could be summoned on command. "That's not what happened, sir," he had said it once. Then he had let the machine outlast him. A scratching sound pulled him back. Mason lowered his hands. Ranger stood at the rear wall of the unit, front paws braced against a wide sheet of cheap plywood. His nose was pressed to the lower seam. He scratched twice, stopped, sniffed, then scratched again with more urgency. "Leave it," Mason said. The dog did not. "Ranger, it's rats." Ranger turned his head and looked at him. There was no excitement in the dog's face, no prey drive, no sharp bounce of a shepherd chasing something alive. He was focused in that old canine way, patient, certain, waiting for the slower human to catch up. Mason stood with a groan. "All right," he muttered. "I'm coming." The back wall looked like everything else in the unit, damp, stained, forgotten. But once Mason brought his flashlight close, the wrongness appeared. Two dark vertical lines ran from top to bottom, almost exactly 3 feet apart. They did not bloom outward like water stains. They were too straight, too clean. He touched one. The plywood shifted. Mason went still. Ranger sniffed at the bottom edge and whined once, low in his throat. Mason searched through the debris until he found a rusted pry bar beneath a pile of mildew-soft magazines. It felt cold and gritty in his hand. He wedged it into the seam and leaned his weight slowly, trying not to make noise, though he did not know why. The nails protested. The panel peeled away with a damp wooden groan and fell forward into the mess. Behind it was a narrow space between the false wall and the cinder block back of the unit. Not accidental built. Mason aimed the flashlight into the gap. 3 objects sat on the concrete floor in a neat row. A leather document tube, cracked with age. A small cedar box darkened by time. And a black metal case with 2 combination locks and a strip of old silver duct tape across its lid. For a few seconds, Mason did not move. The whole world seemed to shrink to the cone of flashlight and Ranger's breathing beside him. The junk, the cold, the $80, the shame, all of it loosened its grip. Not gone, just pushed aside by something older and stranger. Ranger had not found treasure. He had found intention. Mason pulled the objects out, one by one. The cedar box was light. The document tube had something inside that shifted when he moved it. The metal case was heavy enough to make his injured knee complain. His first urge was to open everything right there. Then he looked over his shoulder. The storage unit door was wide open. The office had his name, or at least the name he had written on the form. The facility had cameras. The road beyond the fence was not empty. Mason did not know what he had found. That was reason enough to be careful. He packed the cedar box and document tube deep in his rucksack. He wrapped the metal case in the least disgusting blanket he could find and carried it under one arm. Then he pulled the ruined plywood loosely back into place, lowered the unit door, and slipped out through the side gate with Ranger close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The walk back to East Bank Machinery felt longer than it had that morning. Every car seemed to slow. Every distant siren became personal. Mason changed direction twice without planning it. Ranger picked up on his tension and moved in a tight heel, ears turning, body ready. By the time they slipped through the factory fence, evening had soaked the city in blue shadow. Inside the security office, Mason wedged the broken chair beneath the doorknob. It would not stop anyone determined. But sometimes a useless gesture was the only kind left to a man. He sat on the concrete floor with Ranger pressed against his back, aimed the flashlight at the objects, and opened the cedar box first. Inside were photographs. Old ones. Glossy edges curled with age. A man in his 30s standing in front of a brick building with a rolled-up blueprint beneath one arm. A woman laughing beside a pickup truck. A little boy on a bicycle, helmet crooked, mouth open in a shout the picture could not preserve. Beneath the photos lay a small brass key taped to a card. The card had one sentence written in faded ink. For whoever still believes the dead deserve the truth. Mason felt the back of his neck tighten. He picked up the leather document tube. The cap resisted, then came loose with a dry pop. Inside was a bundle of papers tied with string, and a letter sealed in an envelope yellowed with age. No wax, no drama, just a name written on the front in careful block letters. To the person who finds this, Mason opened it slowly. The handwriting inside was uneven but readable. My name is Harold Whitaker. If these papers are in your hands, then I am either dead or too afraid to do what should have been done years ago. Maybe both are true. Mason stopped breathing for a moment. Ranger shifted behind him. He read on. My brother, Daniel Whitaker, did not die in an accident on June 14, 1998. The newspaper said a boiler rupture killed him inside the old Fairlane glass plant in Akron. The county report said negligence. The company report said he ignored safety warnings. None of that is true. Danny was murdered because he found documents proving that North Star Redevelopment and men inside the county government falsified contamination reports on land they planned to sell for housing. He was going to give those documents to a reporter. He never made it. They called it an industrial accident. They buried him with a lie. Mason lowered the page. The security office seemed colder than before. He looked at the black metal case. It sat in the flashlight beam like a weight from another life. There were more pages. Harold described his brother Daniel as a union safety inspector who had grown suspicious after workers became sick around the abandoned Fairlane site. Daniel had found internal memos, altered soil tests, payment records, and a property deed that did not match the public filings. The lands was supposed to be cleaned before any redevelopment. Instead, North Star planned to cap the worst areas with asphalt, pressure the county into rezoning the site, and sell it as a family subdivision. Daniel had proof. Then Daniel died. Harold had been threatened after the funeral. Not in alleys. Not with guns. Men in suits came to his office, spoke politely, asked about his children, mentioned how easily grief could confuse a man. He panicked. He took the documents Daniel had left with him and hid them behind the wall of a storage unit he paid for under his late mother's name. For 27 years, he kept paying. For 27 years, fear kept winning. The letter ended with words that made Mason's throat close. Daniel had a daughter named Grace. She was 8 when he died. She deserves to know her father was not careless. She deserves to know he was brave. If I could not be brave in life, maybe I can at least leave courage where someone better than me might find it. Please find Grace Whitaker. Please do not let my brother be remembered by the lie that killed him. Mason read the last line 3 times. Then he folded the letter and sat very still. He did not want this. That was the first honest thought. He did not want a dead man's truth. He did not want a corporation, a county cover-up, a locked case full of evidence, or a daughter who had spent most of her life not knowing the shape of the crime that stole her father. He did not want a mission. He wanted food for Ranger, a room with heat, one night without old sounds tearing open old rooms inside his skull. But the dead had a way of finding men who had already been hollowed out. Mason thought of Wade Collins. Wade, whose daughter probably grew up hearing that her father had made a mistake. Wade, whose laugh existed now only in a few memories, and maybe a video on someone's old phone. Wade, whose name Mason had failed to defend because the machine was patient and he was tired. Daniel Whitaker had been given the same burial, not just under dirt, under paperwork. Mason looked at Ranger. The dog's eyes caught the flashlight glow. What did you drag us into? Mason whispered. Ranger thumped his tail once. It was not comfort, it was answer enough. The next morning, Mason hid the metal case before sunrise. He carried it deep into the main factory, through a corridor where old safety posters curled off the walls and pigeons scattered from overhead beams. He found a maintenance pit beneath a rusted grate in the floor, dry and half filled with dust. Using the pry bar, he lifted the grate just enough to slide the case inside, wrapped in plastic from the storage unit. Then he replaced the grate and scattered debris over it, until the place looked undisturbed. The letter and photograph stayed in his pack. He needed information. Information meant a library. Mason had avoided libraries for years. They were warm places for people who belonged indoors. People with clean hands and quiet phones and somewhere to go afterward. But the main branch downtown had public computers, and public computers did not ask a man why his coat smelled like smoke and river ice. The problem was Ranger. At the entrance, a sign beside the doors read "Surface Animals Only." Mason stood on the steps, looking at it, feeling something small and frightened tighten behind his ribs. He had not left Ranger alone in public since the day the dog came home with him. It was not just attachment, it was structure. Ranger watched the world when Mason could not. Ranger woke him before nightmares turned violent. Ranger stood between him and strangers without needing to be told. Now Mason needed him to wait. He led the dog to a stone column partly sheltered from the wind and knelt in front of him. "Stay," he said. Ranger's ears flattened slightly. "I'll come back." The dog leaned forward, pressing his forehead hard against Mason's chest. Mason held him there for 1 second longer than he should have. "I'll come back," he repeated. Inside the library, heat struck his face hard enough to make his eyes sting. The place smelled of paper, floor wax, and coffee from a small kiosk near the entrance. Students sat beneath brass lamps. An old man read a newspaper with a magnifying glass. A woman at the circulation desk looked up, smiled politely, and then tried not to stare at Mason's boots. He found a computer in the back corner. His fingers were stiff on the keyboard. Daniel Whitaker, Akron, 1998 boiler accident. The search results came quickly. Local safety inspector killed in industrial accident. Fairlane glass site. Claims 1 life. County report cites failure to observe warning signs. The articles were short, flat, final. Daniel Whitaker was described as experienced but perhaps overconfident. Officials expressed sorrow. North Star Redevelopment promised full cooperation. A county commissioner praised the company's commitment to revitalizing abandoned industrial land. Mason knew the shape of the lie immediately. He searched North Star Redevelopment. A world opened. Luxury apartments in Columbus, riverfront retail in Cincinnati, mixed-use communities, charitable donations, scholarship funds, ribbon cuttings. The founder, Preston Vale, stood smiling in photographs beside mayors, governors, hospital boards, children in hard hats. He had the clean, pale face of a man who had never lifted anything heavier than a pen, but had moved entire neighborhoods with signatures. Preston Vale had become Ohio's favorite builder. Mason searched Grace Whitaker. Too many names appeared at first. A dental hygienist in Dayton, a teacher in Toledo, a realtor in Florida. Then a recent article from a neighborhood paper caught his eye. Community attorney Grace Whitaker challenged North Star Harbor Light Project. Mason clicked. The photograph loaded slowly. A woman stood outside a county meeting room, one hand raised mid-sentence, dark hair pulled back, eyes sharp with exhaustion. She was in her mid-30s, wearing a navy coat and holding a thick folder against her chest. Behind her, residents held signs about drinking water and soil safety. Mason took the cedar box from his pack and found the photograph of the little girl on the bicycle. Same eyes. Grace Whitaker had grown into the fight her father died trying to begin. For a long moment, Mason just stared. A person could call that coincidence if they wanted to sleep well. Mason no longer had that luxury. He found the address of Grace's legal aid office in Tremont. There was an email form, a phone number, a staff page. All the easy ways to make a mistake. He had learned enough from Wade's death to distrust easy channels. At the library gift shop, he spent $3.29 on a plain card and an envelope. Then he sat at a table near a window and wrote slowly, because his hand shook when he tried to hurry. "Ms. Whitaker, you do not know me. I found something that belonged to your father, Daniel Whitaker. It was hidden for many years. I believe it concerns his death and the Fairlane property. I cannot send it electronically. I cannot bring it to your office. I do not know who can be trusted. If you want to see proof that this is real, meet me this Saturday at 2 p.m. at Edgewater Park, near the old stone concession building. Come alone if you can. I will be wearing a brown field jacket and I will have a dark German shepherd with me. A friend." He hesitated over the last 2 words. A friend was too much. He crossed them out and wrote instead, "Someone who believes you deserve the truth." From the cedar box, he took one photograph of Daniel Whitaker crouching beside his daughter as she sat on the bicycle. On the back in blue ink, someone had written Gracie, first ride without training wheels, May 1997. Mason made a copy of one paragraph from Harold's letter at the machine near the reference desk. Not the murder accusation. Not yet. Just the part describing Daniel's concern about the Fairlane soil tests and his intention to contact a reporter. He placed the copy and the original photograph in the envelope. When he stepped back outside, Ranger was still sitting by the column. Snow had begun to fall in small, hard pellets. The dog's coat was dusted white, and he trembled with cold, but he had not moved. The moment he saw Mason, his control broke. He stood, whining under his breath, and pushed into Mason so hard, Mason nearly lost balance. "I came back," Mason said, burying his hand in the dog's neck fur. "I told you." Ranger made a sound that was not quite a bark. Mason mailed the letter from a blue box 2 blocks away. The envelope disappeared through the slot with a soft metal flap. It should not have sounded like a shot. But it did. The 3 days before Saturday were harder than the cold. Mason and Ranger stayed mostly inside the security office, leaving only when necessary. Mason rationed food until hunger made him lightheaded. He visited a church pantry on Thursday, where a volunteer gave him 2 cans of soup, a loaf of bread, and a small bag of dog kibble after Ranger sat politely by the door and won her heart without trying. At night, Mason read Harold's letter until the words became worn paths in his mind. He thought about Grace. He imagined her opening the envelope, her hand stopping over the photograph, the old childhood image hitting some locked room inside her. He wondered if she would come angry, afraid, or not at all. He also wondered who else might notice. On Friday afternoon, a black SUV rolled slowly past the broken fence outside East Bank Machinery. Mason watched from behind a shattered window in the main plant. The vehicle did not stop. It did not need to. Ranger stood beside him, silent, every muscle awake. "They're not looking for us," Mason whispered. He wanted to believe it. Ranger did not blink. Saturday came under a low white sky. At noon, Mason ate half a slice of bread and gave Ranger the last full cup of kibble. He checked the letter in his pocket, the photographs, the brass key, the copied notes. He did not take the metal case. The evidence was too important to carry into a public meeting, too heavy, too visible, too easy to lose. "We meet her," he told Ranger. "Then we decide." The dog watched him. Mason took a bus west, then walked the last mile to Edgewater Park, because he did not want to arrive by the obvious route. Lake Erie spread beyond the trees in a flat sheet of pewter, the water restless beneath the winter wind. The park was half empty. A few joggers. A young couple taking pictures near the lake. A man throwing a tennis ball for a Labrador that seemed delighted with the weather in a way only dogs and fools could be. Mason did not go to the concession building at first. He took a position near a line of bare sycamores where he could see the building, the parking lot, and the path from the road. Old habits returned without asking permission. Sightlines, exits, hands, vehicles with engines running. Ranger sat beside him, but his body leaned forward. At 1:57, a gray Subaru pulled into the lot. Grace Whitaker stepped out. She was smaller than Mason expected, or maybe the article had made her seem larger, because she was fighting men with buildings named after them. She wore a black wool coat, jeans, and boots salted white at the edges. Her hair was tied back. She carried no purse, only her phone and the envelope Mason had mailed her, folded hard in one hand. She walked to the concession building and stood there with her shoulders tight. She did not look like someone walking into mystery. She looked like someone bracing for insult. Mason waited 30 seconds too long because his fear argued for leaving. Ranger rose. The dog had made the decision. Mason stepped out from the trees. Grace saw him immediately. Her hand moved toward her pocket. Not dramatic. Practical. Phone, keys, maybe pepper spray. Her eyes moved over his beard, his field jacket, the dog, the limp he could not hide. Mason stopped 10 feet away and raised one hand. "Miss Whitaker, you sent this." She held up the envelope. Her voice was steady but thin at the edges. "Yes. Who are you?" "My name is Mason Cole." That name did something to her face. A flicker of recognition. Not enough to place him, but enough to bother her. "You said you had something of my father's." "I do. If this is about money, say it now." The words came sharp, and Mason did not blame her. Desperate men with stories were not rare. He looked like the kind of man people cross streets to avoid. He moved slowly, unzipped his pack, and took out the cedar box. Grace's expression changed before she understood why. Some objects carry the hands that once touched them. The cedar box must have been one of those, because her mouth parted slightly and all the rehearsed anger left her eyes. "This was hidden with the letter," Mason said. He opened the box and took out another photograph. Daniel Whitaker, sitting on porch steps with Grace, asleep against his chest, one small hand gripping his shirt. Grace did not reach for it at first. Then she did. Her fingers trembled once, barely, and she covered it by gripping the photo harder. "I've never seen this," she said. Her voice had dropped so low Mason nearly missed it. "My mother said most of the pictures burned. They didn't." Grace looked up. "Where did you get these?" Mason handed her the copied paragraph from Harold's letter. She read it quickly at first, then slower. Her eyes stopped halfway down, color drained from her face. She turned away toward the lake as if the wind had struck her. "Harold," she said. "Your uncle. He left when I was 9. Sent checks sometimes. Birthday cards with no return address. My mother hated his name." Grace swallowed. She said he knew things and chose fear. Mason said nothing. Grace read the paragraph again. "Is there more? Yes. How much more? A letter, documents, a locked case." The word case made her eyes sharpen. "What documents?" "Harold said your father had proof, falsified contamination reports, payments, property records, something about North Star redevelopment and county officials." Grace closed her eyes. It was not shock exactly. It was confirmation arriving too late to feel like relief. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew Fairlane was dirty. I knew North Star was lying. But my father—" She opened her eyes and looked at Mason with sudden force. "The official report said he ignored safety warnings. I read it. He never ignored safety warnings in his life. I believe you. You don't know me." "No." Mason looked toward the lake. "But I know that kind of report." Grace studied him for the first time not as a threat, not as a beggar, but as a man with history. "Mason Cole," she said slowly. "You were in the news years ago." Mason's jaw tightened. "My dad followed military stories. I remember your name. Afghanistan. You testified about a contractor failure. I tried to. What happened? They called it something else." Grace understood more than he had said. People who fight institutions develop a second hearing for what is missing. A gull cried overhead. Ranger suddenly turned his head toward the parking lot. Mason followed the movement. A black SUV sat near the entrance road. It had not been there before. The windows were too dark for the gray day. No one got out. Grace noticed his stare and looked. Her face hardened. "They followed me." "You're sure? I've seen that car twice this week." Mason's body went cold in a clean, useful way. "Walk," he said. "What?" "Not fast. Toward the path. Keep talking." Grace did, though her hands had tightened around the photograph. Ranger moved between them and the parking lot, casual enough not to draw attention, tense enough that Mason felt the leash vibrate. "They broke into my office last month," Grace said under her breath. "Nothing stolen. Just enough moved so I'd know. 2 donors pulled out after private calls. My phone clicks. My assistant thinks I'm paranoid." "You're not." "No," she said. "Apparently not." They reached a bend in the path, partly screened by pines. Mason stopped. "The case isn't with me." "Where is it?" "Safe." "Safe where?" He did not answer immediately. Grace gave him a bitter look. "You dragged me into a park with my dead father's photograph and now you don't trust me?" "I trust that you're being watched." She absorbed that. Anger flickered, then respect. "Fair. I need someone who can open the case without handing it to the police." Grace almost laughed, but there was no joy in it. "Half the county board eats lunch with Preston Vale. If we take this to the wrong detective, the evidence disappears and we get called unstable. You know someone?" "One person." She looked back toward the SUV. "Ray Mercer, former U.S. Marshal. He investigated public corruption before he resigned. North Star helped ruin his career after he got too close to a bribery case. He works private security now in Lakewood. Can he open locks? If he can't, he'll know someone who can without asking stupid questions." Mason watched the SUV. It was still there. Grace put the photograph carefully inside her coat. Her voice changed when she spoke again. Less lawyer, more daughter. "Mr. Cole, if what you found is real, then my father didn't just die. He was erased." Mason thought of Wade. "Then we unerase him." For the first time, Grace looked as if she might break. She did not. She walked faster. Her Subaru smelled faintly of coffee, legal pads, and dog treats. Ranger jumped into the back seat after one careful command. Mason climbed in beside him, awkward in the clean interior. Grace started the engine, but did not pull out right away. She looked at the photograph again. "My mother waited for someone to say this," she said. "For 20 years, she died angry because nobody did." Mason had no answer. Some grief does not want comfort. It wants witnesses. Grace drove with the focus of a person who had spent years being underestimated and had stopped correcting people because their mistake was useful. She did not take the direct route. Twice she turned without signaling. Once she pulled into a gas station, waited beside a pump without getting out, then left by the far exit. The black SUV did not follow them there. "Where's the case?" she asked. "East Bank Machinery." Grace glanced in the mirror. "The abandoned plant off the river?" Mason nodded. "That place is condemned." "So am I, depending who you ask." She almost smiled, almost. They reached the plant just after 4, when daylight had begun to thin, and the factory windows caught the sky in broken gray pieces. Grace parked behind a wall of collapsed brick hidden from the street. Mason told her to wait in the car. "No, this isn't a courtroom, and I'm not your liability." He looked at her and saw the same stubborn line in her jaw as the man in the old photographs. "Stay close," he said. Ranger went first through the fence gap, then Mason, then Grace. Inside the plant, the air was colder than outside. Their footsteps crunched over glass and old pigeon bones. Grace looked around at the dead machinery with a grief that seemed strangely personal. "What?" Mason asked. "My father used to bring me places like this," she said, "not inside, but near them. He'd point at old factories and say land remembers what people do to it." Mason said nothing. They reached the maintenance pit. Ranger stopped. Not gradually stopped, his head lowered. A sound came from him that Mason had heard only twice before, low and almost swallowed. Mason froze. Grace whispered, "What is it?" The answer came from behind a row of rusted presses. "Smart dog." Two men stepped into view. They wore dark coats too clean for the place. One was lean, mid-40s, pale, with a face that looked friendly until he smiled. The other was younger, heavier, his hands bare despite the cold. The lean one held no weapon that Mason could see. That made him more dangerous, not less. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "you do choose unusual meetings." Grace's great face closed. "Evan Rusk." Mason did not look away from the men. "You know him?" "North Star's counsel." Rusk gave a small bow. "Consultant." "Counsel sounds so stiff." His eyes moved to Mason. "And you must be the veteran, Mason Cole." "That took our people most of the afternoon." "You used to be somebody." Ranger's growl deepened. Mason kept the leash short but loose. Rusk noticed. "Beautiful animal." "I'd hate for him to misunderstand the situation." Grace stepped forward. "We're leaving." "You are," Rusk said, "after Mr. Cole gives back what he found." Mason felt the old room inside him open. Gray carpet, clock ticking, men who smiled while placing their hands over truth. "I found trash," he said. Rusk's smile thinned. "You bought trash, then you removed property that did not belong to you." "From a unit I purchased legally." "Complicated," Rusk said. "Courts love complicated. Men in your position usually don't." The heavier man shifted, blocking the path behind them. Mason measured distance. 16 feet to Rusk, 12 to the heavy man. Loose glass underfoot, Grace on his right, Ranger ready, too ready. A fight would be stupid. The case was beneath the grate 3 steps behind Mason, and the men were watching his eyes. That meant they did not know exactly where it was. Rusk said, "Mr. Cole, you've had a difficult life. Nobody needs it to become harder. Walk away. We'll even make sure you and the dog land somewhere warm for a while." Mason almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because Wade Collins had once said the first bribe is never money. It is relief. Grace looked at Mason and he saw fear there. Not for herself. For the evidence. For the possibility of watching truth disappear again. Mason lowered his gaze just enough to Ranger. "Back," he said softly. The dog obeyed, stepping with him as Mason moved away from the maintenance pit, not toward it. Rusk misread the motion as retreat. Good. Sensible. Mason kept backing toward a side aisle between machines. "We're leaving. You'll be contacted." "I bet." Grace moved with him. The heavier man started to follow, but Rusk raised 2 fingers. "Let them go." A warning had been delivered. Men like Rusk trusted warnings because most people obeyed them. Mason did not breathe normally until they reached the fence. They did not have the case. In the car, Grace gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles blanched. "We left it," she said. "They don't know where it is. They'll search the whole plant. Not if they think I moved it already." She turned to him. "Did you?" "No," Grace stared. Mason looked back toward the factory. "Which means we need to move faster than they do." Ray Mercer's office was above an old hardware store in Lakewood, with a narrow staircase that smelled of dust and machine oil. Grace called him from a payphone outside a diner because she did not trust her cell. When Ray opened the door 20 minutes later, he wore jeans, a thermal shirt, and the expression of a man who had not been surprised by bad news in decades. He was in his 60s, thick through the shoulders with close-cropped white hair and eyes that took inventory without seeming to move. He looked at Grace, then Mason, then Ranger. "Dog comes in," he said. That was how Mason decided he liked him. Ray listened without interrupting. Grace spoke first, too quickly, anger and fear tangling her words. Mason filled in the details she did not know. The storage auction, the false wall, Harold's letter, the case. The men at East Bank. Ray asked for the letter. Mason handed it over. The room was silent while Ray read. Outside the window, traffic hissed over wet asphalt. Finally, Ray lowered the pages. Harold Whitaker was a coward, he said. Grace flinched. Ray looked at her. And maybe the only reason we have anything. Both can be true. Grace looked down. Ray turned to Mason. You left the case at East Bank? For now, bad place, I know. Good hiding spot. Good enough if nobody has all night. Ray stood. Then we don't give them all night. Grace grabbed his arm. Ray, Rusk saw us. If we go back, we don't go back like scared civilians. He looked at Mason. You still remember how to move in the dark? Mason did not answer right away. The honest answer was yes, but memory was not the same as readiness. His knee hurt. His hands shook sometimes. His mind could turn against him without warning. But Ranger was sitting beside him, looking toward the door as if the night had already begun. I remember enough, Mason said. They waited until after midnight. Ray drove an old white plumbing van with magnetic company signs on the doors and toolboxes in the back. No one looked twice at a work van in an industrial district, especially not in winter. Grace wanted to come. Ray told her no, she argued. He told her no again with the kind of quiet finality that did not invite court motions. Mason expected her to argue a third time. Instead, she turned. Bring my father home, she said. Not the case. Not the proof, my father. Mason nodded once. The factory at night was a different animal. Ray parked 2 blocks away. Mason and Ranger entered through the fence first, followed by Ray carrying a compact bolt cutter, a lock kit, and a flashlight with a red filter. Snow had begun again, soft enough to hide sound but not tracks. Mason moved slowly, placing each step where old debris would not betray him. At the maintenance pit, the dust had been disturbed. Mason's stomach dropped. The grate had been moved and put back badly. He lifted it, empty. For a moment, the factory seemed to tilt. Ray swore under his breath. Ranger did not look at the pit. He looked left. The dog pulled once, firm, toward a corridor leading deeper into the plant. Mason almost corrected him. Then he remembered the storage unit, the false wall, the certainty in Ranger's body when human eyes had failed. Go, Mason whispered. Ranger moved fast, nose low, following a trail Mason could not see. Ray followed without question. They passed old lockers, a collapsed office, a room full of rotted pallets. At the far end of the corridor, Ranger stopped beside a loading bay where the concrete floor sloped toward a rusted drain. A fresh scrape marked the dust near a stack of sheet metal. Ray crouched and aimed the red light. They staged it, he whispered. Moved it, maybe got interrupted. Behind the sheet metal, wrapped in torn plastic, was the black case. Mason let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Ranger nosed the case once, then turned toward the darkness behind them. The sound came a second later, metal against concrete. Ray killed the light. Mason put one hand on Ranger's collar. Voices moved somewhere near the main floor. 2 men, maybe 3. Not close yet, searching. Ray leaned close. Can you carry it? Yes, it was a lie. He carried it anyway. They moved through a side passage Ray had spotted on the way in. Twice they froze as flashlight beams cut across distant walls. Once Ranger's hackles rose and Mason felt the dog gathering himself for a sound. Mason pressed his fingers gently into Ranger's neck. Not yet. The dog held silence. They reached the fence with the case between them and the van 2 blocks away. Then a voice called, "Hey, no warning shot. No chase music. Just one word splitting the night." Mason ran. His knee failed on the second block. Pain flashed white. He stumbled, nearly dropping the case. Ray caught the handle and took half the weight. Ranger wheeled back, not running ahead, not leaving him. A flashlight bounced behind them. Boots hit pavement. Move, Ray snapped. Mason moved. They reached the van as a dark sedan turned onto the street. Ray threw the case inside. Ranger jumped in after it. Mason hauled himself up, biting back a sound as his knee twisted. Ray slammed the doors, climbed behind the wheel, and pulled away slowly. Not fast. Fast made people remember. The sedan slowed at the corner behind them. Ray turned right, then left, then into an alley behind a closed bakery. He killed the lights and engine. The van sat in the dark, ticking as it cooled. Ranger stood over the case, ears forward. The sedan passed the alley mouth without stopping. Only then did Mason realize he was shaking. Ray looked at him. You all right? Mason laughed once through his teeth. No, Ray nodded. Good. Means you're paying attention. They opened the case in Ray's office at 2:43 a.m. The brass key from the cedar box fit a small hidden latch beneath the duct tape. The combination locks were old but high quality. Ray worked them with patient hands and tools Mason did not ask about. It took 34 minutes. When the lid finally clicked open, no one moved for a moment. Inside were folders sealed in plastic, ledgers, photographs, cassette tapes, a stack of floppy disks, and a thick envelope containing property documents. Ray lifted the first folder and began reading. Grace, who had arrived after Ray called her from a burner phone, stood beside the desk with both hands pressed flat against the wood. Mason watched her face as she saw her father's handwriting. Not grief first, recognition. As if some part of her had been waiting since childhood for proof that the man she remembered and the man in the official report were not the same. Ray laid out the evidence piece by piece. Soil reports with original contamination levels circled in red. Altered versions submitted to the county. A payment ledger showing consulting fees routed through shell companies. Photographs of buried drums near the Fairlane site. A memo from North Star's internal counsel warning that residential development could expose children to unsafe lead and solvent levels if full remediation was not completed. And then the property deed. Ray read it twice. Well, he said. Grace looked up. What? Your father bought a controlling parcel inside the Fair redevelopment zone before North Star consolidated the site. According to this, the transfer after his death was executed by Harold under pressure. But the original notarized deed was never surrendered. There's enough here to cloud title on the whole project. Grace covered her mouth. Ray continued, quieter. And enough to reopen Daniel's death if we put it in front of the right people. The right people, Mason said. Ray looked at him. Not local! Grace was already thinking. Federal environmental crimes. Public corruption. A reporter outside Ohio. Multiple copies. Exactly, Ray said. They worked until dawn. Ray scanned everything on an offline machine. Grace called 2 people from numbers she had memorized, not from her phone. One was an investigative reporter in Chicago who had covered redevelopment fraud. The other was an attorney at a national environmental law nonprofit. Ray contacted an old colleague at the Department of Justice, a woman he trusted because she had once testified against her own supervisor and paid for it. Mason mostly sat with Ranger near the door, guarding nothing and everything. Around 6, Grace stepped into the hallway and found him there. Her face looked older than it had in the park, not weaker, just less protected. I spent my whole life thinking the truth would make me feel better, she said. It doesn't always. No, she leaned against the wall. It makes the wound honest. Mason looked at his hands. Grace said, What happened to your friend? He almost said, long story. He almost said, doesn't matter. He almost said nothing. Instead, he told her. Not all of it. Not the nights under bridges. Not the worst parts. But enough. Wade Collins, the hydraulic failure, the report, Colonel Sloan. The way a lie can become a wall if enough people are paid to stand in front of it. Grace listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, Do you still have anything? From Wade? Records, notes, copies. Mason shook his head. I lost most things. Most? He looked at her. Something that had been lying dead inside him moved once, painfully. By mid-morning, the first copies were out. By noon, the reporter called back in a voice that had lost all casualness. By evening, the story was no longer containable. The article did not publish that day. Real reporting took time, verification, calls for comment, legal review. Men like Preston Vale survived because they knew delay could be a weapon. But Ray's old contact confirmed enough to trigger federal interest. The environmental nonprofit filed an emergency motion to halt activity at the Harborlight project. Grace's office received calls from residents who had been ignored for years. North Star responded with polish. The company denied wrongdoing. Preston Vale expressed concern over unverified materials of questionable origin. Evan Ruskos called Grace claims politically motivated. Local television showed old footage of Daniel Whitaker and referred to new questions surrounding a decades-old industrial death. Questions. That was how truth entered the room when power still had a hand on the door. Not as victory, as questions. But questions were enough to make men sweat. 2 days later, federal agents executed search warrants at North Star offices and the county archives. 3 days later, a retired county inspector came forward. A week later, another man did. The story widened. It always had been wider. Daniel Whitaker was not the only one who had known. Harold was not the only one who had feared. The old lie had many fingerprints. Mason watched most of it from Ray's office couch, with Ranger asleep on the floor beside him. Grace made sure they had food. Ray pretended not to notice when Mason took extra rolls from the diner and tucked them into napkins for later. Nobody called him homeless. Nobody called him hero. Both words felt too simple. On the 9th day, Grace received a package from the Chicago Reporter. Inside was a printed copy of the first major story before publication. She brought it to Ray's office and handed it to Mason. The headline read, Hidden documents challenge official story in 1998 death of Ohio safety inspector. Mason read Daniel's name, Harold's confession, North Star, Fairlane, Grace's fight. A brief paragraph mentioned the documents had been discovered by a former Army sergeant and his dog after a storage auction. Former Army sergeant. Not vagrant, not transient, not problem. Mason had to set the paper down. Ranger lifted his head and watched him. Grace sat across from him. "You okay?" Mason nodded. It was not true, but it was closer than usual. The article broke on a Thursday morning. By noon, Grace's phone would not stop ringing. By 3, North Star stock partners had suspended funding on Harborlight. By evening, Preston Vale appeared on camera looking wounded and statesmanlike, insisting he welcomed a full review. Evan Rusk stood behind him, face composed, but Mason noticed the tightness around his eyes. Men like that did not fear outrage, they feared records. The legal fight lasted months. A story like this does not end when the article goes live. That is where people who have never fought power imagine the music swells. In real life, the days after truth emerges are full of motions, denials, missing files, sudden illnesses, retired officials with bad memories, and good people wondering if they can afford to keep being good. Grace did not become instantly safe. Mason did not become instantly healed. Ranger still woke him from nightmares. But the direction of their lives changed. Ray helped Mason file for lost military records. Grace connected him with a veterans legal clinic, not in the soft, pitying way people sometimes offer help, but like one fighter handing another a tool. It turned out Mason had kept one thing from Wade's case without remembering its value. An old flash drive sealed inside a shaving kit at a mission locker downtown, left there years earlier and never claimed. On it were maintenance photos, email screenshots, a draft statement Mason had written and never sent. Not enough to destroy Colonel Victor Sloan by itself. Enough to begin. Grace said that was how most buried truths returned. Not whole, piece by piece. In spring, Daniel Whitaker's death certificate was amended pending further investigation. The official language changed from accidental, industrial death to undetermined circumstances. It was not the full justice Grace wanted. But when she saw the document, she tried so quietly that Mason pretended to be reading something on the wall. Harold Whitaker had died 2 months before the storage auction. Grace visited his grave once. She did not forgive him there. Not exactly. She stood with the cedar box in her hands and said, "You should have told me." Then, after a long time, she added, "But you left the door open." Mason stood far enough away not to hear more. Ranger sat beside Grace until she was ready to leave. That summer, the Fairlane site was fenced off under federal order. North Star's Harborlight project collapsed. Residents who had been dismissed as alarmists received water testing, medical screenings, and, for the first time in years, official letters that did not treat them like inconveniences. Preston Vale was not led away in handcuffs on television. Not then. Real villains often exit through side doors with attorneys and statements. But 2 county officials resigned. Evan Rusk lost his position. A grand jury convened. Men who had built careers on silence began revising their memories. Grace kept fighting. Ray kept digging. Mason stayed. At first, he slept on Ray's office couch, then in a small room above a garage owned by a veteran from the legal clinic. The room had a radiator that clanked at night, a narrow bed, and a window facing an alley where weeds grew through cracked pavement. Ranger claimed the rug beside the bed and refused all attempts to move him. The first night there, Mason woke at 2 in the morning and did not know where he was. No bridge overhead, no factory walls, no wind cutting through concrete. Just radiator heat, Ranger breathing, and the hum of a refrigerator downstairs. Mason sat on the edge of the bed until the panic passed. Then he cried once, silently, with both hands over his face because relief can hurt when it enters places that have been locked too long. Months later, Grace invited him to a community meeting at a church basement near the old Fairlane site. Mason almost did not go. Crowds still made his skin feel too tight. Praise was worse than anger. But Ranger nudged his knee when he sat too long staring at the invitation. So he went. The room smelled of coffee, wet coats, and folding chairs. Residents filled every row. At the front, beside maps and legal documents, stood a framed photograph of Daniel Whitaker. The same kind eyes. The same stubborn mouth. Not the careless man from the report. Not the footnote. A father, a worker, a man who had tried. Grace spoke without drama. "My father believed land remembers," she told the room. "I think communities remember too, even when records are changed, even when people are threatened." even when the truth is hidden behind walls and left for strangers to find. Her eyes found Mason near the back. He looked down at Ranger. The dog sat calmly at his feet, as if none of this was remarkable, as if finding the seam in a rotten storage wall had been no different from finding a scent in snow. Grace continued. We do not honor the dead by turning them into saints. My father was stubborn. My uncle was afraid. I have been angry for most of my life. The man who found these papers was not looking for a cause. He was trying to survive. That matters, because justice is not always carried by people who feel ready. Sometimes it is carried by people who are tired, hungry, frightened, and still unwilling to drop it. Mason had to leave before the applause started. He stepped into the church hallway, breathing carefully. Ranger followed and leaned against his leg. A few minutes later, Grace found him there. Too much? She asked. I'm sorry. No, Mason rubbed Ranger's head. It was good. Grace stood beside him in the quiet hallway. The reporter called. They're doing a follow-up on you? No. I told them you'd say that. Good. They asked what you wanted people to know. Mason stared at the floor tiles. One was cracked near the baseboard. Someone had tried to fix it with the wrong color grout. After a while, he said, "Tell them the dog found it." Grace smiled. That's it? He did. And what did you do? Mason looked through the hallway window at the dark street outside. Snow had started again, soft under the streetlights. I listened. Grace did not answer right away. Then she nodded. That may be the whole lesson. Winter returned to Cleveland eventually, as winter always does. But Mason did not return to the bridge. On the anniversary of Daniel Whitaker's death, Grace organized a small gathering at the Fairlane fence. No speeches for cameras, no politicians. Just neighbors, workers, a few reporters standing back, and a table with coffee that went cold too fast in the wind. Mason came with Ranger. He had trimmed his beard. His field jacket was the same, but clean. He still limped. He still checked exits. He still flinched sometimes when buses braked. Healing had not made him new. It had made him less alone inside the old damage. Grace placed a hand on the fence and read a short statement from her father's notebook, one found inside the metal case. A place can be poisoned by what is buried beneath it, but people are poisoned by what they agree not to see. The wind moved through the weeds. Mason thought of Wade Collins. He had begun working with the Veterans Clinic to reopen the contractor complaint. It would take time, maybe years. Maybe nothing would come of it. Maybe Colonel Sloan would die with his pension and his version of events intact. Mason knew better now than to confuse beginning with winning. But he also knew silence was not neutral. Silence had weight. Silence had fingerprints. After the gathering, Grace walked with Mason along the fence line. Ranger moved ahead, nose down, investigating rabbit trails in the dead grass. I used to think justice meant someone pays, Grace said. Doesn't it? Sometimes. She watched Ranger pause near a patch of snow. But maybe it also means someone is finally seen clearly. Mason thought about that. Across the lot, Daniel's photograph had been fastened to the fence with wire. The wind lifted one corner gently. My friend Wade had a daughter, Mason said. Grace looked at him. I don't know where she is now. We can find her. The words were simple, not dramatic, not a promise of victory. Just the next right thing placed on the ground between them. Mason nodded. Ranger barked once from ahead, not alarmed, just impatient. The kind of bark dogs give when humans stand too long among ghosts. Mason and Grace followed. That was how life continued. Not as a clean ending, not as a miracle, as one step after another beside those willing to walk with you. Years from then, people would tell the story differently. Some would say a homeless veteran won a storage unit full of junk and found a fortune. Others would say a dog discovered evidence that brought down a powerful developer. A few would turn it into something neat enough for headlines. Something with a clear hero and a clear villain and a satisfying final line. But Mason knew the truth was quieter. He had not found gold. He had found a responsibility. Ranger had not solved a mystery like dogs do in children's stories. He had simply noticed what people had stopped looking for. A seam, a draft, a wrongness in the wall. And maybe that was why Mason loved him most. Because the dog never cared what a man used to be called. Hero, failure, homeless, broken, witness, coward, survivor. Those were human tags, paper tags, the kind systems used to sort people into boxes and leave them there. Ranger only knew whether Mason got up, whether he came back, whether he listened when something hidden asked to be found. The deepest truths in life are often not buried because no one knows them. They are buried because someone was afraid. Someone was paid. Someone was tired, or someone believed their voice would not matter against a wall built by powerful hands. But walls are strange things. They look solid until one creature with enough patience finds the seam. And once the seam is found, even a broken man can put his hand against it and push.